After decades of use and neglect, U.S. infrastructure struggles to accommodate the current needs of society and is unprepared for future dynamics. For reference, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave United States infrastructure a C- grade in 2021. Several factors have contributed to these unfortunate conditions. Public construction spend as a portion of GDP has declined relative to historical levels, reducing maintenance and progress on newer projects. At the same time, we have factors such as climate change and population growth that are increasing the wear and tear on infrastructure assets while effectively reducing their useful lives. We can see the impact of these trends across several distinct infrastructure categories. In terms of transportation, about 43% of roads are in poor or mediocre condition, while 7.5% of US bridges are structurally unsound. On the utilities side, there are plenty of issues as well. 70% of transmission lines across the country are at least 25 years old, while water managers lose 6 billion gallons of drinking water daily due to leaky pipes. The American Society of Civil Engineers forecast that between 2020 and 2029, $2.59 trillion in US infrastructure spending needs will go unmet. They also predict that this gap in infrastructure spending could reduce American GDP by $10 trillion through 2039. Although the condition of infrastructure in the United States represents an economic hurdle, we also view this challenge as a driver of demand for the companies that could ultimately fix the situation. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, authorizes $550 billion in new federal spending and represents one of the most significant infrastructure investments in US history. The bill certainly goes a long way toward building and developing traditional transportation infrastructure assets. The $110 billion allocation toward roads, bridges, and highways is the largest category within the bill, while tens of billions of additional dollars are directed towards rail, airports, and waterways. Certainly roads and bridges are what many of us think when we hear the word infrastructure. However, the bill also addresses several next-generation structural needs. For instance, the IIJA dedicates $73 billion for power infrastructure and grid improvement, $65 billion for digital infrastructure and broadband, and $15 billion toward EV charging and electrified transportation. As such, the IIJA not only delivers upgrades to long-standing infrastructure needs in the United States, but also prepares us for disruptive trends such as grid electrification or surging data volumes. Yes, in the first year since passage in November 2021, federal grants flowed to the state level largely on schedule, with investments translating into progress on projects and even contract wins for engineering and construction firms. Over $185 billion in IIJA funding is now available at the state level, and more than 10,000 projects can be connected to these investments, according to White House data. The three states receiving the greatest share of announced IIJA funding thus far, California, Texas, and Florida, account for as many as 1,400 projects. Most identified projects remain in their planning stages, with several logistical steps remaining before building or renovation can begin. However, these projects are likely to indicate where IIJA-funded construction could occur. In some cases, the infrastructure bill is already replacing critical transportation infrastructure. A notable example is the Fern Hollow Bridge in Pittsburgh, which made headlines when it collapsed in early 2022. Officials from the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation were able to secure $23.3 million in IIJA funding to expedite restoration efforts, allowing the bridge to reopen to traffic in December 2022. The Biden administration estimated that without the IIJA, this project could have taken 2 to 5 years to secure funding and complete construction. The Fern Hollow Bridge is far from the only major transportation asset that is receiving IIJA-funded upgrades. To date, IIJA funding is responsible for launching 2,800 bridge repair and replacement projects across the country, according to the White House. IIJA implementation is only beginning, but early results are encouraging for participants in the U.S. infrastructure space. we think it is important to remember that this package is not intended as instantaneous stimulus. Rather, it is a long-term investment that is likely to play out over more than a decade. As such, many infrastructure management teams contend that the projects announced in 2022 are only a fraction of what is to come. We think supply chain reshoring is a considerable one. The pair of black swan events in recent times, namely the COVID-19 pandemic and invasion of Ukraine, prompted US companies to reconsider their decentralized supply chains. Many management teams hope to build out domestic manufacturing capacity, which could create opportunities throughout the US infrastructure space. Indeed, supply chain localization is an increasingly common topic in corporate presentations and news stories in the United States. By the end of Q4 2022, the prevalence of supply chain reorientation buzzwords, such as reshoring and onshoring, in news stories increased by almost 9 times relative to pre-pandemic levels. It's not just talk. These considerations translated into more construction activity in recent quarters. Private construction spend on manufacturing totaled $125 billion for the month of November 2022, 43% more than in November 2021, and 71% more than in November 2020. Additionally, private manufacturing construction grew nearly 4 times faster than all other private construction between November 2020 and November 2022. Especially as other legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS Act kick in, we do expect to see this emphasis on supply chain security to continue to benefit US infrastructure companies. Another trend we are watching is climate change in relation to infrastructure. Natural disasters are occurring with unprecedented frequency and intensity, presenting risks to freshwater supplies, real estate, transportation infrastructure, and energy grids. US infrastructure must be built or modified to withstand these events and other climate change-related impacts. The need to modify or even relocate major structures to account for the shifting environment is likely to stimulate demand for construction services.